That's a very good question. Turns out that the crypto industry may be shady.
Huh.
But who could have possibly seen that one coming?
Have you ever wanted a podcast that did it all? Sports, politics, world events. Well, you have come to the right place, because you are listening to C&C Talks.
Hello, I'm Colin,
And I'm Charlie.
and welcome to the C&C Talks podcast. This is episode 36 of season 2.
Just a reminder, as we do every week, we release every Wednesday and we talk about politics, world events, and sports. It's currently Monday, November 13th, 2023 at about 9 o'clock p.m. Pacific time.
Yes, and what a week that we chose to take off because a lot happened.
Oh, and by a lot, you mean a lot in basically every single event area that we cover. Huge week in politics, big week in world events, and a massive amount of stuff going down in sports. So we don't really have any time to waste. Let's get started here.
Yeah, and Charlie, let's start with the election results that just came in last week. So they're not presidential elections, not congressional elections. This is just like local elections for the most part. A couple states had governor's elections, Kentucky and Mississippi, some ballot initiatives in some states, some state legislature races, some just other local races. Seattle had city council elections, for example, all sorts of various races. And Charlie, let's start with that Kentucky governor's race. Now, Kentucky, obviously, a very red state. Trump won it with 62% of the vote. Charlie, a Democratic governor was elected in the state of Kentucky.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the interesting things that I didn't hear a lot of people talk about is the fact that the Democrat here is actually the incumbent, which may surprise a lot of people. He won in 2019, but this was actually a very big move for Kentucky. Obviously, no surprise that most likely the Republicans will take whoever is the nominee, which is looking more and more like it will be Donald Trump. Very much likely that he will still take that state anyway. But this does hurt Republican efforts to really do anything anymore within the state of Kentucky, and could really change the landscape on how we consider Kentucky. However, it is still very likely that the Republicans still maintain control in this deep red state.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go that far because the state legislature there, it's still a veto-proof majority for the Republicans in the state. So there's a limit to what Democratic Governor Andy Beshear can do there, just like there was during his last term. But still, executive actions do exist. There's definitely a lot of stuff that he can do. He ran a pretty brilliant campaign, tailored it to the state of Kentucky, didn't really bring in a lot of national figures, whereas Daniel Cameron, the Republican candidate, he's the Attorney General of the state of Kentucky, he brought in all of the heavy hitters. Mitch McConnell was involved, obviously. McConnell from the state of Kentucky. Donald Trump was involved. So he brought in everyone, and it just did not go his way. Beshear won by an even bigger margin than he won in 2019, which does signal that his policies have been very popular, especially regarding the issue of abortion, something that Charlie did very, very well on Tuesday.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly in Ohio and in Virginia for two different reasons, actually. The one in Ohio was a direct vote on an amendment to the state's constitution, and in Virginia, it was a legislature vote that really will harm the Republican efforts from the governor to attempt to restrict abortion as well. Also in Ohio, a vote on marijuana passed as well, allowing the legalization of usage of marijuana as well. Colin, can we get a little bit more on how big these issues are, particularly not only for these two states that have signed these bills, but now also for what this means for both of the parties and their opinions on those events and those ideas as we move into 2024?
Yeah, so I think that voting on candidates and voting on issues is just very, very different. And like generally, the liberal position on issues tends to win, but for whatever reason, Republicans tend to do better when it's a candidate on the ballot as opposed to an issue. Like Ohio, a red state, I would say now, it did vote for Obama twice, but now looking pretty clearly into the Republican camp. But they did legalize marijuana, and then abortion, they legalized. And Charlie, it's a trend that you're seeing all over the country. Abortion is very popular. There's now been 7 states that have voted on the right to abortion. directly as a ballot measure, and Ohio is now the seventh state that pro-abortion movement has won. California, Vermont, and Michigan, I believe, they all enshrined the right into their state constitution, just like Ohio did, guaranteeing access to everyone, while there were anti-abortion measures last year on the ballot in Montana, Kansas, and Kentucky. Charlie, all of those efforts failed. So the pro-choice movement is just getting huge wins. Abortion is a winning issue for Democrats, too, as we saw in the midterms last year. And then, like you mentioned, in Virginia, one of the big promises from Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, if he got back control of the state Senate, would be that he would pass a statewide abortion ban. Virginia, the only state in the South without a statewide abortion ban. But he was not able to retake the Senate. The Republicans did gain a seat in the state Senate. He also lost the Virginia state House, so a really bad night for Virginia Republicans, even though you could argue that Democrats may have underperformed. There's an argument that they could have done a lot better in Virginia. Winning both chambers of the state legislature, that's a pretty huge deal, Charlie.
Absolutely. But one of the things that I think is interesting is the Democrats really used abortion in 2022 during the midterms because of what happened with Roe v. Wade earlier. And they obviously used it here in 2023 as well. But the question is, how long can they use that as a winning issue?
I mean, I personally think that it can be a winning issue for Democrats for a long time, right? The issue, it's not one that's going away. People are still very concerned by the issue of abortion. After all, it's still illegal in many, many states across the country. Joe Biden could probably pretty easily make it a big part of his re-election campaign and basically say, hey, this guy that I'm running against, which is almost certainly going to be Donald Trump, he appointed the three of the justices to the Supreme Court that helped overturn Roe v. Wade, took away abortion access. That could, I think, be a big winning issue for Joe Biden and for Democrats around the country. Charlie, I don't see this issue going away anytime soon.
No, absolutely not. But it's just a question of how long can they keep using that on a national stage before voters understand their position and stop really using that as their big push. Considering that the Republicans in popular ideas have the wins on ideas like the economy as well, which of course, which is one of if not the top current issue among voters.
Yeah, I mean, issue polling is interesting on like what's the big issues that are motivating voters, because like, for example, I think that a lot of people whose abortion is their number one issue aren't necessarily going to say that, partly because they're afraid in some way, and it's somewhat personal to a lot of people. They're not necessarily going to share that in a poll. But with the economy, again, Charlie, it's really strange to me that it's the Republicans that have way higher marks on the economy than Democrats, given that the economy consistently does better in Democratic administrations, and Republicans seem to be fairly incompetent at even basic stuff. We'll get to the budget coming up later in this show.
Yes, we will. And in fact, let's move on to some more stuff in the political event space, particularly with the third Republican debate. We had 5 candidates qualify, including Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley, as well as Ron DeSantis. But Tim Scott did not, and in fact, he dropped out.
No, he did qualify, but he dropped out after.
He did drop out after the debate, as well as now with Mike Pence being gone as well, that field is beginning to narrow.
Yeah, Chris Christie also on that debate stage. Neither him nor Scott really impressed, basically anybody. Moments from the debate, DeSantis looked a little bit better, still seemed fairly awkward, but maybe seemed better, at least gave some answers. The beginning of the debate, there were some candidates who went after Trump a little bit, but the subject was really not talked about after that. Trump, again, skipping the debate. He held a rally like 30 minutes down the road in another that this debate was held in Miami. It was moderated by NBC News, who I thought did a much better job than Fox News did in the first 2 debates, just on like keeping order. There was a lot of substance discussed, but I did have a problem with some of the questions from NBC News. I found it kind of gross that they steered away from Trump for the most part, because I feel like you kind of have to talk about the leading candidate. Also, Hugh Hewitt, a conservative pundit, was one of the moderators. Just found it kind of gross that they were treating him like an actual journalist, which he is very, very far from. But Charlie, it's still really interesting to me that none of these Republicans are willing to truly attack Trump. There's so much that they could attack him for. He's been in court for the last several weeks now on he has 91 felony counts against him. These are all things that you would generally use against someone, but really it just seems like they're all running for second and then hope that he dies or goes to jail and that they can then be the nominee.
Yeah, it seems like that really is their only way to even reasonably do anything.
Yeah, I don't know. It's strange. One other really fascinating moment from the debate was Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. We've seen them feud quite a bit. They seem to really, really hate each other. And then there was a moment when they were discussing TikTok when Ramaswamy attacked Haley because her daughter, who by the way is 25, has an account on TikTok. So Ramaswamy said she should maybe deal with her family first, to which Haley said, keep my daughter's name out of your voice, and then called Ramaswamy scum.
Just the things that these people say, and the fact that they're still taken seriously by some people, and the fact that they're, in some instances, the more reasonable candidates of the party are just insane.
Well, I actually thought that Haley's comment made sense because Ramaswamy just took a shot that was completely unnecessary and should be immediately disqualifying. You don't bring the candidate's family into it like that. It's just it's gross.
I just don't understand what Ramaswamy is trying to do here. I think it's rather clear that even if he does win at all, which obviously he won't, but it's interesting to see that even this move that he's doing now, he's polling, I don't know, I think about 3 or 4%.
Maybe a bit more than that, maybe like 7. But like, what's the plan here, dude?
Yes, but because of his opinions and how far right they are, I just don't think, even if he by some miracle manages to win the primary, he won't win. He won't go anywhere in the general election.
Oh no, he's crazy and he's just a complete and total jerk.
Yeah, no, just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, moving on now to another story in the political sphere, yet another one involving those candidates from the debate. This one was the one who did not show up, as they so elegantly said in the first debate that he did not show up. The elephant's not in the room. Donald Trump. What's he up to now, Colin?
He was in a bit of a different room this week, Charlie. Specifically a courtroom in New York where he was testifying in his civil fraud trial. Again, he's being sued by the state of New York for fraud for $250 million. Showed up, took the stand. It did not go well. He could not seem to avoid perjuring himself. And you can't really plead the fifth in New York in a civil case because in a criminal case you can, but in a civil case you're allowed to, but it will be taken basically as an admission of guilt. So Trump couldn't really do that. So he just kind of deflected. He wanted to read a statement out of his pocket. The judge said no. It was wild. I think Trump just wanted to make it a circus. He maybe succeeded a little bit, but either way, especially since there's no jury in this trial, it's just the judge because Trump's team literally forgot to ask for a jury. This cannot be impressing the judge. I don't know if New York will be able to get $250 million out of it, but it's not looking good for Trump, we'll put it that way.
No, it is not. Now let's move to some a little bit more ominous news. That government shutdown that we avoided just a few weeks ago, it is looming up yet again. The government will shut down on Friday at midnight if nothing is passed. And in fact, it doesn't look like Congress can do much of anything right now because the only resolution that they've put across is the resolution that McCarthy did that got him removed. So this is yet again going to go nowhere. The Republicans won't support it. So thus we find ourselves in the same situation we had. We're going right down to the wire again. It doesn't seem like this group could do anything at all, except maybe possibly push it down the line again and fire Johnson, which would just cause the exact same loop again.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating situation in all of the worst ways. They had like a month and a half, but they spent 3 weeks of that finding a new speaker and then the next 2 on vacation. So now they're here. And by here, I mean just about nowhere. Charlie, what you were referencing, it's like basically a clean continuing resolution. So no cuts, something that the Freedom Caucus is, again, not thrilled with. It's the same thing that McCarthy did. I could see Democrats voting for it again. Probably more Democrats will vote for it than Republicans. Now, that might mean that it can actually pass and the government stays open for a few more months before we have to do it all again in January or something. But what does that mean for Mike Johnson's future? Are the far right going to sacrifice him next? I mean, time will tell, but it's, again, just a complete circus in Washington. It keeps on being a circus over and over again.
Yes, it does. Now, let's move on now to someone who has been convicted and is going to face a long time in prison. Sam Bankman-Fried, former owner of the crypto exchange FTX, was convicted of security fraud and wire fraud, and as I said, can face up to 110 years in prison from those counts. So
yeah, it's a long time.
So how did we get here, Colin?
That's a very good question. Turns out that the crypto industry may be shady.
Huh.
Who could have possibly seen that one coming? And Sam Bankman-Fried, some ways maybe a genius, and in some ways just completely nuts, convicted on 7 counts. This was a months-long trial, and Charlie, it only took the jury like 4 hours of deliberating to convict him on all 7 of these counts. The case was pretty open and shut. I mean, I guess that's what happens when you have a text message thread titled wire fraud.
I mean, can you make it any more obvious?
I don't think that you could possibly make it more obvious. I mean, we say that Trump makes his crimes very obvious, but this guy may make them even more obvious.
Yeah, you DM Biden saying that you've committed wire fraud.
Yeah, yikes. This dude is going to be in jail for a long time. I doubt he'll actually get the full sentence because it's not a repeat offender, although I would say that probably matters less when given the gravity of the crimes that you're facing. And he's pretty young as well, so I doubt he'll even spend the rest of his life in prison, but it could be a long time.
He's 31.
Yeah, he's 31. Could be a long time, so
yeah. Absolutely. Let's move on now to one of the many people who have been able to, in the Senate, who haven't been able to really do anything due to the fact that the House is still on fire, and that is Joe Manchin, who is retiring from Congress, possibly to set up a third-party bid for the presidency in 2024.
I mean, we'll see. He's been kind of coy with his plans on that. I don't think it's a good idea for him to run. The entire point would basically just be to draw votes away from Biden and bring them to Trump, and that's just not a good idea. But Manchin, for Democrats, or is this bad for Democrats? I can see arguments on both sides because it basically means that they're guaranteed to lose this seat in 2024. Republicans will win this West Virginia seat almost certainly. On the other hand, though, it means Democrats don't have to put nearly as much money into this race, a race that they were probably going to lose anyway. And Charlie, we've talked about just how difficult that Senate map is for Democrats. I mean, not having to spend money here means you can focus on the other 7 seats that you just absolutely have to hold to have a chance at keeping that Senate majority. So we'll see. I think that it might actually benefit Democrats in a way, but Manchin, he's leaving behind, Charlie, a very complicated legacy in the Senate because on one hand, by being against abolishing the filibuster at every step of the way, he hurt progress a lot. He blocked a lot of things, all in the name of bipartisanship. But at the same time, he did provide key votes for Democrats from the state of West Virginia, something that not many others could have accomplished.
Yeah, one of the other interesting things is he does tend to be towards the middle of a lot of issues, which I think
at the center, basically.
Which I think it would be very interesting for a run. You said that this would hurt certainly Biden, as he would lose some votes, as Manchin had run as a Democrat. But I do think it will really also hurt Trump. I'm not saying that the moderate Republicans would vote for some of the more moderate Republicans would vote for Manchin necessarily, but I'm saying that option would now be open for what, as they see, the better candidate in the options between between Biden, certainly, who they deem as completely unacceptable. I could see them accepting a more moderate candidate such as Manchin.
It's interesting, right? Because I feel like Biden has to win some of those moderate Republican votes, the anti-Trump Republican votes, in order to win the presidency, right? I don't think that there's really any anti-Biden Democrats who would vote for Trump. That just seems extremely unlikely to me. But there's some that I think Democrats that they might vote for Manchin just because, or sorry, moderate Republicans that might vote for Manchin because they don't want to vote for Biden, but they can't vote for Trump. So I feel like giving them that extra option, basically, I think it will take more votes away from Trump than it will take away from Biden. It will take away more votes from Biden than it will take away from Trump. But I guess time will tell if he even does run, which, again, that's far from a certainty. And even if he doesn't, there are plenty of other third-party candidates running in the 2024 election, such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, and some others. Jill Stein.
Yeah, there still is certainly a lot of options. Speaking of just the insanity that seems to have been gathered around politics for the last, well, I don't know how long it's been. It's been a while. But Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, has now had his phone seized by the FBI as part of an investigation into his campaign dealings with the Turkish government. What is it with U.S. politicians getting involved with Middle Eastern countries, specifically from Turkey? Because wasn't there an incident recently?
Dr. Oz.
Well, yeah, with that. But then wasn't there also a few weeks ago something that we talked about where there was someone who was involved with the government of Egypt?
Yes, that was Bob Menendez, yes.
Bob Menendez. What is going on right now in politics?
I don't know.
This is bad news for him. There's already a lot of backlash currently to him with his campaign with issues such as immigrants and all the immigrants who are currently in New York with not a lot of places to go, and that city, of course, filling up rather rapidly. As big as that city is, they're starting to run out of room. But what is it with New York mayors? They just can't seem to get it right, can they?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Charlie, remember who the last mayor of New York was? Bill de Blasio. That didn't go well. Before that, Michael Bloomberg. And before that, Rudy Giuliani. So, yeah, it hasn't gone well for the city of New York. Maybe you guys should start to elect some competent candidates. And I think also, at least at the moment, this may speak somewhat to the just true incompetency of the New York State Democratic Party. They have no candidates, no way of fundraising. It's just a disaster up there for Democrats in New York. They way underperformed in the city council elections in New York City that were last week, despite Democrats doing pretty well just about everywhere else in the country.
Yeah, that certainly is interesting, especially due to the size and voting trends of New York City.
Yeah, and it's still definitely a liberal city, just not nearly as much as it was, maybe, or maybe it's just people aren't voting for whatever reason, partly just because the party has done a terrible job of organizing voters.
Now, if you remember back a couple of weeks ago, we discussed the United Auto Workers strike that ended, and now we have another one. The big strike in Hollywood has now ended, as both the actors and the writers' strike have ended, and those union workers are getting back to work. Thus, the film industry will finally be able to start getting up and running again.
Yeah, huge wins for pro-labor groups, Charlie. This is huge. The last several months, first the writers, the United Auto Workers, and now the actors. This is a big deal.
It certainly is, and this, of course, this not only has a big impact on workers that are within the union, but also workers that aren't in the union as well get some gains from this, even though they don't necessarily get the amount of gains that they would get if they were part of these unions. But the companies that they work for now are also concerned about possibly more unions and will thus most likely give some increased benefits to prevent more unionization. So this really benefits all the workers.
Exactly. Really, really big deal. Now let's move on to some stuff that actually did happen in Congress. I know it's shocking that stuff happened in Congress, but start with the censure vote on Rashida Tlaib. She's one of the only Muslim members of Congress, along with Ilhan Omar, a Democrat, very progressive Democrat, and a Palestinian American. Charlie, she was censured for basically anti-Semitic speech after saying from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, which is basically a calling for genocide against the Israeli people. Do you agree with this decision to censure Rashida Tlaib?
I think with comments like those, I think it is necessary. However, it does set a dangerous precedent. And that is that really, if they say something that your party doesn't agree with, I know that this is, of course, an issue that is far beyond that. This is an issue that is calling for the genocide of a group of people. But it does begin to set a precedent that you can begin to censor people for issues that could be smaller than this. And we'll see how that develops, obviously, as this war continues on. And it, of course, doesn't really look good for your country to censor one of its two Muslim members of Congress.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that, like, obviously what she said is extremely wrong. I don't think that I don't know how anybody could possibly condone what she said. At the same time, I do think it was wrong to censure her, not because her actions in a vacuum might not be worthy of a censure, but because of what censures have become. It's been impossible to censure members of Congress on the right for literally trying to overthrow the American government, and yet there's no actions there. The same people who are willing to do nothing about that are the same people censuring this one Muslim member of Congress for gross statements, but even then, not nearly as gross things as those Republicans have done. And I mean, if you want comments on the war that are gross, just take Brian Mast of Florida, who said something along the lines, he's a Republican, said something along the lines of that all Palestinians support Hamas and therefore we don't care about any of them. That is also a really gross statement that deserves to be censured, but I doubt he's going to be censured. So for me, this looks more like an Islamophobic move than something that's actually meant to harm Tlaib in any way, to actually condemn it. It's really just condemning the fact that she's Islam. In my opinion, that is in no way, again, defending what she said, which was horrible.
Absolutely. Let's move on now to a man that we just cannot stop talking about because he keeps coming up. No, it's not Trump, not DeSantis.
We've talked about him already.
It's George Santos.
George Santos, everyone's favorite person that we aren't sure whether his name is actually George Santos or not.
Which we mention every time we bring him up.
Well, I mean, you kind of got to, because you don't want to talk about someone if you're not sure that you're using their right name, right? So you've just got to make sure that you're letting people know that we're not quite sure that we're saying his name correctly.
Yeah, so what's he up to now?
Well, so there was another action in Congress. This was an expulsion vote brought by his fellow New York Republicans. And so it would need a 2/3 majority to pass, and it failed. George Santos was not expelled. It did not even get a majority. And in fact, more Democrats voted against this than voted for this. Charlie, what do you think about this? Should he have been expelled from Congress?
I mean, my opinion on it is, if you're doing things that are shady as what he's done, you deserve to be removed. However, very much surprises me that he wasn't. And I think this is an very interesting move by the Democrats to exactly why he wasn't. So actually, that's one of the questions that I have. What are your thoughts on why the Democrats didn't vote to remove him?
Well, so first of all, a majority of Democrats did, but there was a group, roughly 30 Democrats, I believe, that voted not to expel Santos. And I kind of understand both arguments, because sure, what it looks like he did should be grounds for expulsion. At the same time, you do want to give people due process. Santos has been indicted, but he has not been convicted yet. Generally, it's normal for when you're indicted to resign your committee assignments. That has been done. But it's not normally custom to resign from Congress upon an indictment, generally only upon a conviction or potentially the results of an ethics investigation into George Santos. Now, there is currently an ethics investigation going on. We should know some results from that soon, and then maybe we could get back on the expel George Santos train. But for now, it at least seems, even if I don't necessarily agree with it, I think that it's at least a fair argument that he deserves due process, as strange as he has been in the last year.
All right. Now, let's move on. We have some new information about new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. So, which number are we on for the amount that we've had so far? We're still on 2. Or are we moving on to the third one that we've had so far in this Congress?
The third what? Speaker?
Maybe not. We'll see. Anyway, we have some new information on Mike Johnson. What is this new information, and how does it affect him?
Yeah, so it's just been a constant stream of stuff coming out about him, some statements that he's made in the last few years. Because remember, he was a relative nobody. So now that he's become a somebody, there's lots of research going into his past statements, lots of stuff being dug up on him. And I could go on a whole list, but Charlie, I just want to highlight one thing, okay? He said that he and his son monitor each other's porn intake. That seems like a very, very normal people do with their son.
Huh. Okay, I'm just gonna leave that there.
Yeah, let's leave that there.
Let's move on. The Supreme Court voted on a code of conduct, which they surprisingly actually accepted. What is this new code of conduct, and how does it affect the court?
Long story short, it doesn't affect the court. I mean, it's the first time ever that the Supreme Court has imposed a code of conduct on themselves. It gives some regulations for when they're supposed to recuse themselves, when stuff regarding taking bribes, a whole bunch of stuff, and it portrays itself as suggestions, not something that you have to follow, just suggestions, which makes it not really a code of conduct, especially since there's not really any method of punishment for violating this code of ethics. It's not really binding in any way. The only people that would actually have a power to enforce it is the Supreme Court, and they're not going to do that. So really, it's just meaningless. It's just an effort by the court to try to restore faith in the court with the American public and with the Senate, who is currently investigating them.
All right, let's move on to just a little update about what we're doing here on C&C Talks. We're going to be introducing a little bit of a new thing here. We will be introducing a update on the stock markets, a new little fiscal report every week. We got some about the big movers, big fallers, and generally what's going on with the stock market in the U.S. economy. And we'll be starting that up next week. Now let's move on to world events.
Yeah, and Charlie, I think we've got to start with the Israel-Palestine war, or Israel-Hamas war may be a more accurate way of portraying it. What are the latest developments in Gaza?
Israel continues to move its advance into Gaza and into Gaza City. They, of course, have to clear those suspected tunnels that Hamas uses. There's also an update from that a hospital in northern Gaza that had completely run out of fuel. They are doing their best to try to continue to work with the people that they have there. They have no fuel, they have no power, and they're rapidly running out of water as well. Israel has claimed Israel offered minimal amount of fuel that would have powered the hospital for, I believe, only a few hours. But the hospital and its staff, as well as the Palestinian Ministry of Health, said it would be impossible to, 1, evacuate the hospital, and 2, to access that fuel that Israel had offered. Now, Israel claims that they are doing this due to Hamas militants using the tunnels underneath the building as a place to attack Israeli forces. As Israel moves further into Gaza and this humanitarian crisis builds, the international reaction to this continues to grow in support for Palestine and against Israel's aggression in the region after the attacks by Hamas in Israel on October 7th.
Yeah, so Charlie, I have a few thoughts on this, and I'm not entirely sure whether you'll agree with them, so I would like your response to them afterwards. But like, what Israel is doing here is, at least in my opinion, pretty clearly war crimes. Like, they've done a siege. That is clearly a war crime and a blatant violation of international law. They are making the Palestinian people suffer. As much as people try to connect Hamas and the Palestinian people, the last time that there was an election in Gaza was 2006. The majority of the people that currently live in Gaza, which is over 2 million people in a tiny area, the majority of them are children. That means that the majority of people that live in Gaza were not alive the last time that there was an election. And so, like, it is clear that that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, and that there cannot continue to be the level of suffering unforced on the Palestinian people. Don't get me wrong, what happened in Israel is absolutely tragic. That was also war crimes. In fact, it was a terrorist attack by Hamas. It was extremely gross. But that does not mean that you've got to respond with, frankly, reckless disregard for human life in Hamas. And at some point, when you're bombing the amount you're doing, first of all, it's impossible to avoid civilians. Second of all, you're just further radicalizing the people. And third of all, at what point do we just have an Afghanistan situation on our hands where we're just fighting Hamas, who, again, is a terrorist group and deserves to be banished, honestly? At what point are we just fighting them like we fought the Taliban in something that'll never end until actually Israel decides to leave? Charlie, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do agree with the fact that the Israeli attacks on these civilian centers could be counted as war crimes. However, I do want to state the fact that Hamas also really does not care about the lives of their civilians whatsoever as well, and are in fact using some of these, according to Israel, are using some of these buildings to shelter their own forces.
I mean, yeah, I agree with that, but again, that doesn't mean continue to bomb the Palestinian civilians. Like, not even close. Like, I get the problem with the ceasefire. I fully understand it. Hamas is not going to respect the ceasefire, obviously. Okay, then what's the outcome? Like, what outcome are we going for here? I don't like. It's not like Hamas is just going to go away. And in fact, by doing this, you're just further radicalizing the people there. So it's complicated. There's, again, like so many issues, like we've said this so many times with Russia, Ukraine, there's not a clear solution here to the problem. And to chalk it up as there's some easy solution that's practical would ignore literally thousands of years of history in that area. So we shouldn't do that. But at some point, right, like, people have lives to live.
Yeah, yes, they do. All right, let's move on now to some U.S. news now, and something that we don't really often cover, the world of religion. You
I
could
don't
argue,
think we've ever talked about the Catholic Church on this show, Charlie.
to be fair though, you could argue that the Israel-Hamas war does certainly have some religious undertones, and it's
A
certainly
lot.
certainly that is one of the main causes of the war. But moving
Absolutely.
back to or the new news here. Pope Francis has removed a bishop in Texas. That bishop is Joseph Strickland. This is a very rare move. In fact, Strickland had previously spoken at a Stop the Steal rally in favor of Donald Trump, and spoke at anti-LGBTQ protests. However, I am not actually. This is not surprising that a bishop spoke at anti-LGBTQ movements, due to, of course, the church's historical ideas on the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and I would say Pope Francis, it's still a long shot from fully embracing the LGBTQ community, but he has been, I would say, more accepting than past popes. Again, he still has not been very accepting. It's a very low bar to clear.
Oh, it absolutely is. Now, let's get to one of my favorite things that we do on this show, and that is Charlie's stat of the week. This week in the NFL.
Almost 40 minutes in, and we're here.
Yeah.
We've made it to the halfway point.
Yeah, this week's stat of the week. In the NFL, we had 5 games. Now 6 games, actually, considering Monday Night Football, end on a game-winning field goal. So that made me wonder, who has the most field goals in a game? So that's the question for today. I'll give you the year. The year is 2007, if that helps at all. Which team's kicker and who is that kicker has the most field goals in a game? And how many did he kick?
I don't even know how I could begin to answer this. I don't even know who the kickers in the league were in 2007, so I don't even think it's worth guessing, Charlie. How about you just tell me?
All right, it's Tennessee Titans kicker Rob Baronis. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He converted 8 field goals in a game against the Texans, and Tennessee ended up winning by 2. They ended up winning 38-36. He converted field goals of 52, 25, 22, 30, 28, 43, 29, and 29 yards.
Did he happen to miss a field goal in that game, or was he a perfect 8 for 8?
I think he was 8 for 8.
That is pretty impressive, actually. Especially some of those field goals are pretty long, Charlie.
It is interesting though to see he had one field goal from 21 yards. You had to be like right on the goal line.
Yeah, pretty close to the goal line. Yeah,
and then he had 28 and 2 29-yarders too.
So it sounds like a lot of failed red zone drives.
It really, yeah, it does. I need to look more into what happened in that game.
Inside the 10.
Now, let's move to a story that we probably should have covered last week if we had an episode. Baseball is over. We have a World Series champion. It's the Rangers. Who saw this coming?
At the beginning of the season, no one. But as the season progressed, that offense just began to look completely legit. There were clear issues on the pitching side, Charlie, but they were able to overcome them in the World Series, winning 6-5 in game number 1 in 11 innings, a huge walk-off home run by Adolis Garcia. Diamondbacks, they took game 2 in massive fashion, 9-1. Rangers won game 3, won game 4, and shut out the Diamondbacks in game 5, 5-0. Charlie, they went a perfect 11-0 on the road this postseason. That is ridiculous.
No, it's absolutely incredible what they've done.
And Corey Seager, he was named the World Series MVP, a ridiculous series. Max Scherzer and Adolis Garcia, they had to be taken off the roster after game 3. So they're pretty big losses, but the Rangers, they were still able to battle through. They have some dudes on that roster. And Charlie, I look at their roster heading into next year. I don't see how they do not win the AL West, right? They're still going to have Seager. They're still going to have Semien. Still going to have Garcia, Heim, a great player behind the plate. They're going to have Josh Young still at third base, and he's only going to get better. Evan Carter, he's going to get to play a full season. We'll probably see Wyatt Langford at some point, possibly at the beginning of the year. The pitching staff, we'll see if DeGrom and Scherzer can be healthy. But if they can, then that's arguably the best pitching staff in the league. This could be one of the all-time great teams, I feel like, next year, Charlie.
And they could still sign Ohtani.
Yeah, they're absolutely in the running for that, too. This is ridiculous.
Absolutely.
And now, unfortunately, we are going to have to continue the rest of this episode without Charlie, but we will still move on and we will talk about the NFL. Since our last episode, we've had 2 weeks of games, NFL Week 9 and NFL Week 10, and it would kind of be fruitless, we feel like, to go through each of the games. So what we're just going to do, we're kind of going to go through it by division. And let's start in the NFC West with the 49ers. They were coming off of a pretty bad streak, having lost 3 straight, got a much-needed bye in Week 9, but then a huge win in Week 10 over the Jacksonville Jaguars. Brock Purdy looked like normal Brock Purdy. Really good to see that from him. And the 49ers just have a huge defeat of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who were honestly the NFL's hottest team. The Seahawks, meanwhile, a disastrous loss to the Ravens in Week 9, just terrible on all fronts, but now a huge win over the Commanders, a really good win on a lot of fronts. A really good job, especially by their receiving core, which actually includes Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, who are running backs and have been doing really well as running backs, but have also proven that they can catch passes, that they can at times be used as receivers to great effect for the Seahawks. So we'll see where that takes them going forward. The Rams, it was not a good week for the Rams, at least not in Week 9. A bad loss to the Packers, who, if we're being honest, is just not a particularly good team, not a team you want to be losing to. And then the Cardinals, a bad Week 9, getting shut out by the Browns, but now, obviously they did lose Josh Dobbs to the Vikings, more on that in a minute, but then a big win in Week 10 over the Atlanta Falcons, and that was significant too because it was Kyler Murray's return to action. He was fine, but ultimately propelled their team to a win with a walk-off field goal, something that we saw a lot of throughout the NFL in Week 10. In the NFC South, as we moved into that division, that's an interesting division race because none of the teams are very good, which I think everyone knew heading into this season. None of these teams are going to be very good, and we were, correct. It's looking more and more like, but the Panthers, they can't buy anything. They have just been, to be completely honest, terrible for the last several weeks. They have one win. They're going to have the number 1 draft pick again, almost certainly, except that the Bears own that pick because they traded for the number 1 draft pick. So they this past year to get Bryce Young. So there's basically no talent around him, and they don't really have much to add in the draft. So the Panthers, it's just not a good situation for the Panthers. But the Saints, they're 500, and they are leading that division. That says quite a bit about the state of things in that division. The Buccaneers finally stopping a losing skid that seems crucial if they want to get their season back on track. And then the Falcons, interesting situation at quarterback there. Heineke, who had been starting in place of Ritter, who got benched. He got injured, so they had to bring Ritter into the game. So we'll see as that quarterback battle continues to go back and forth. Then in the North, it really does look like the Detroit Lions are back on track. This is a good team. They can beat a lot of teams in the NFL right now. It's not a team I would want to play. That's what I'll say about that. The Packers still struggling, but how about the Minnesota Vikings, who obviously Kirk Cousins out for the year. They go out, trade for Josh Dobbs, doesn't really know anything about the offense, but still just shows up and does huge things for this team. Pulls them to a couple of wins. They are right back in the playoff conversation. I would say they're probably going to get a playoff spot. And then, of course, the Bears, they're doing Bears things. I doubt we see Fields play again this season. It's pretty bad. The good news, the chance for 2 top draft picks. We'll see what the Bears can get. We'll see if they even want to keep Justin Fields or whether they want to trade him because, as we all know, there's a huge quarterback class at the top of the upcoming draft, and it looks like they're going to get multiple chances to potentially draft a future star at the top. Now, moving on to the NFC East final division here, the Giants, it's pretty bad. They're arguably the biggest disappointment in the National Football League right now. They just keep dropping games that before the season we thought maybe they could win, but they're just not the team, I guess, that we thought that they would be. And I guess Brian Daboll, who got so much credit for them last year, is a brand new coach. I feel like he's got to be getting some of the blame here after this just absolute disaster. And we know how tough it is to play in the New York media market, but there's got to be some responsibility taken here. It is bad what is going on in New York. I thought that they were going to be a better team than the Jets this year once the Jets lost Aaron Rodgers, and they clearly should have been, but they just haven't been. Bad losses, including the Cowboys, who have owned them this year. But the Cowboys, they still have a problem, which is that they cannot beat the best teams in the league. And you have to beat the best teams in the league to go anywhere. And they were just not able to execute against the Eagles in crucial situations, coming up just a foot short sometimes and losing that game. The Cowboys absolutely have to be better. The Eagles, though, the thing with the Eagles that I find really interesting is that they're not necessarily winning a bunch of games in the blowout. They're finding ways to win football games. Now, it's going to be a rematch next week, Monday Night Football against the Chiefs. Really looking forward to that game, a rematch of the Super Bowl. Could possibly be the best game of the season. Could, I would argue, be a preview of this year's Super Bowl potentially. I think it's absolutely on the table that we get a Super Bowl rematch. And then the Commanders, I'd say that the Commanders are probably just underperforming. you could say that they've performed kind of to expectations, but they've done a pretty good job of losing games. They've blown some games that they should have won. Sam Howell has actually, I think, been a pretty good quarterback to this point. He's been sacked over and over again, though. The sacks, again, not entirely his fault, just a terrible offensive line. The Commanders, they have to be better. Moving to the AFC, we've got the Chiefs, who they got a big win over the Dolphins in Germany. They proved that they are still among the AFC's, or in really the NFL's best teams. There were some questions. I think that we now know all of these questions have been answered. I think that this is a team that will definitely go to the playoffs. Definitely, especially looking at the standings right now, win that AFC West. They're probably going to get home field advantage in the AFC Championship game should they go that far. This would be the 6th straight year that they hosted the AFC Championship game, and I think that they have a great chance to go back to the Super Bowl and repeat. But about the Broncos now, a big win over the Bills on Monday Night Football. They've won several straight now, and they're kind of on a roll. They beat the Chiefs as well a couple weeks ago. I mean, this could be a big turnaround for the Russell Wilson era in Denver. I mean, he's looked pretty good. The defense is looking better, albeit against Josh Allen, who had a horrific game on Monday Night Football, but definitely looking better. There is just absolutely no way that we can deny that. The Chargers, they are still another really disappointing team. Another team that just finds ways to lose games over and over and over again. They lost to the Lions on a walk-off field goal. They're too talented to be doing what they're doing. It's kind of shameful how bad they are because they should be so much better. And then the Raiders, they fired coach Josh McDaniels, and it was just an absolute low point for them. Things are looking a lot better. They've won 2 straight. Devontae Adams seems to be a lot happier. Jimmy Garoppolo not playing quarterback anymore. It looks like the Raiders could actually be a threat. And then in the AFC South, the Jaguars, obviously, we talked about that horrendous loss to the 49ers. But are they even still the favorites in that division? They're up a game in the division, but they've still got one left against C.J. Stroud and the Texans, who have been on a roll, and the Texans won their first matchup. And C.J. Stroud, if the Texans make the playoffs, C.J. Stroud should probably be the MVP as a rookie. He's probably a lock already for Offensive Rookie of the Year. He should probably be MVP. What he has done the last couple of weeks when leading game-winning drives and, I mean, breaking the all-time record for rookie passing yards in a single game, I mean, this kid is special beyond words, what he has been able to do. Don't necessarily think either of the other 2 teams in that division are particularly relevant, although Will Levis, he seems to have taken that starting job from Ryan Tannehill and is running with it. Now, is there definitely still stuff to be desired for the Titans? Sure, but part of that I think just has to do with their roster. Part of that just has to do with growing pains for Will Levis, but I do think that he could actually be a pretty good quarterback for them going forward, because Ryan Tannehill, he was fine, but he was never going to really be a long-term solution. It just wasn't really feasible, and I don't think anyone's been impressed with what they've seen from Malik Willis so far. Now, we did say that AFC North division would be among the most competitive in football. I think we're probably right. Browns, a huge win over the Ravens, who had just beat up on the Seahawks. It looks like the Ravens were near unbeatable, but now they lost to the Browns, who are right in that race. The Steelers, they might be the least talented team in football, or at least the least talented over 500 team in football. They're sitting there with a real good record, a real good shot at going to the playoffs. They just find ways to win football games, and ultimately that's all that matters. And the Bengals, somewhat disappointing though too. Joe Burrow did not have a great game against the Texans. Are they back? I mean, it looked like it for a few weeks. Now, there's definitely some doubts about whether the Bengals are indeed back. And move on to that final division, the AFC West. I mean, Josh Allen, what are you doing? I mean, it's bad. He's going to lead the league in interceptions. again, he keeps doing it. I mean, we probably have to just have a conversation about the fact that Josh Allen is not the best quarterback in football, or not even close. He's a good quarterback at best, and he should never really again find his way to the top of the MVP conversation because he's just not good enough to win that award. And the Bills are at a tough point. They've got some decisions to make. Sounds like Stephon Diggs might not be too happy. So we'll see what comes of it. But the fact of the matter is that the Bills have done just about nothing in the playoffs for what's really been a good regular season the last several years. And now they're having, honestly, a bad regular season. They're 500. Now, the Dolphins, they look like a good team if you just look at their record and some of their games. But against teams that are 500 or better, they're 0-3. So, sure, this might be a team that makes the playoffs, but then what? Are you just going to go and lose in the first round? Because that's what it's looking more and more like. And obviously, they still have time to turn it around, but I've got serious doubts. Now, the Jets, Zach Wilson, maybe he's improving, maybe, but even if he is, he's still not very good, and that should concern all Jets fans, because even if Aaron Rodgers comes back at the end of this year, which is possible, I guess, even if he plays all of next year, you're still going to be stuck with Zach Wilson for a few years. And, I mean, you've got to figure out that quarterback situation at some point because Zach Wilson just does not seem to be the answer. Now, probably in a better situation than the Patriots, who seems neither Mac Jones or Bailey Zappi can be an answer, very unsurprisingly. Charlie will not like me roasting Bailey Zappi, but you got to do what you got to do because Bailey Zappi isn't a very good quarterback and he blew the game for the Patriots in Germany. So that does it for the games, but I mean, we do have to talk about the fantasy standings between me and Charlie because we are tied now at 75 points apiece. Of course, with 313 points possibly on the table, you've got to get all the way up to 157. It's neck and neck so far through the first 10 weeks of the NFL season. But now let's turn our attention to the last couple weeks of college football, where there's been some interesting games. Georgia, they have themselves a good opportunity, I feel like, to really jump Ohio State in this week's edition of the College Football Playoff Rankings, which will be out before this show is released. But because Georgia, I mean, part of the criticism was just that their schedule wasn't strong enough, and they got a big win over Missouri, who's the top team. They got a big win over Ole Miss, another top team. Now both two lost teams after those. They're going to have a huge chance against Tennessee this week, who did lose to Missouri. But Georgia, it feels to me like they should be the number one team in the country, especially Ohio State. I mean, they did win by 19 against Rutgers, but it looked a lot closer than that for most of the game. Ohio State able to pull away at the end. And then, of course, they did get that big win over Michigan State. But everyone's getting big wins over Michigan State. Michigan State just does not seem to be that good. Now, Michigan, obviously, Jim Harbaugh now suspended for the next 3 games. We'll see if that gets overturned on appeal in some way, but not good look for Jim Harbaugh, the entire Michigan program, in that sign-stealing scandal that just seems to be getting worse and worse for them. Now, did it let them affect them? Not really. A big win over Purdue, and then a big win over Penn State, who was ranked in the top 10, but now it's another disappointment for Penn State, who just cannot win the big ones ever, it feels like. They really play a 2-game schedule every year. They only play 2 difficult games every year. It's against Michigan and against Ohio State. They can't win either of them really ever, and this year is no exception. Michigan was just able to run all over them. They didn't have to throw a pass in the entire second half, and they still won. That should tell you something. Now, Florida State won a couple of affairs that were a bit too close against Pittsburgh and Miami, but likely going to stay at number 4, though I would argue that Washington, they should probably jump them, even though those wins against USC and Utah were close. Those were 2 teams that were at the time ranked in the top 25, and the Washington offense, it is absolutely legit. I don't think that it's possible to deny that. They, to me, at the moment, are a top 4 team in the country, arguably top 3. Now, we do have to talk about Oregon, because obviously they do have the loss to Washington, but they are beating up on everybody that they play. They beat Cal in week 10, 63-19. This past week, they beat USC 36-27. I mean, this is a good football team in Oregon right here. This team could absolutely beat Washington in the Pac-12 championship should there be a rematch there, as I think is looking increasingly likely. Texas, they were able to escape from Kansas State, a much-needed win. Kansas State kind of doing some stupidity in overtime, but they were able to escape with a win there and a close win over TCU. Currently at number 7 in the rankings. We'll see what happens later. And then Alabama, that big win over LSU and Kentucky. So, I mean, there's a lot of teams that have a chance here. I'd argue that Louisville has a chance. Now, Oklahoma, they lost to Oklahoma State in Bedlam, and that is not a good result for them in the final battle of Bedlam. A couple other interesting scores. First of all, Iowa, they keep getting these historically low over-unders, and they keep getting the under, but they keep winning these games too. Iowa, their offense is so bad, but their defense is good enough that they are probably a top 20 team in the country, if we're being completely honest. Some other games, Oregon State, they're going to jump up quite a bit in the rankings, I think. A&M and Mississippi State, they played each other, and after that game, both of the teams fired their coach. Jimbo Fisher, especially the notable one at Texas A&M, as he's now owed a $77 million buyout over the next few years. So it seems to be a bad decision on that front. A couple other things to go over in college football, which is that there's now been a few spots clinched in conference championship games. Florida State, they will go to their conference championship game in the ACC no matter what. The Big 12, it's kind of a mess. No one really knows who's going, but in Conference USA, Group of 5 conference, it'll be Liberty and New Mexico State. Mid-American Conference, Toledo, they've clinched a spot and maybe have an outside shot at a New Year's Six bowl game with 9-1, 6-0 in their conference. Unclear who they'll play there yet. And in the SEC, it's going to be Georgia versus Alabama. That's a huge game with massive playoff implications. If Alabama wins out, they're probably into the college football playoff. And then in the Sun Belt, Troy clinching a spot in the Sun Belt Championship. It would be James Madison on the other side, but because they're still transitioning to division or to FBS, they are not eligible to play in that game. And then finally, on the Heisman watch, at least personally, I would say Bo Nix, probably the favorite from Oregon, with Michael Penix Jr. of Washington slightly behind. But then there's some other legit candidates. Jaden Daniels, what he's done at LSU the last few weeks has been incredible, though the 3 losses may end up hurting them. Marvin Harrison, Ohio State, he's been great. And so same with Carson Beck of Georgia. So the Heisman race, very, very crowded as well. All right, moving on to the NBA in-season tournament. We've had a few games now, and the courts are hideous. That's the number one comment, the most important comment. But it does seem like teams they care about this tournament. They're not resting players in these games. Like seems to be a big deal. It seems to be at least so far, a success, and we'll see where it continues. And of course, coming up in a few weeks, we'll talk more about college basketball. I did just want to mention real quick, though, on the basketball side, James Madison. It seems like they cannot be beat in any sport right now. They knocked off number 4 Michigan State at home in East Lansing. The first time in his career that Tom Izzo, who's been coaching Michigan State since 1995, has lost at home in the month of November. A devastating loss for the Spartans. Now let's talk a little bit about Major League Baseball, as a few managerial changes around the league. The Giants, they hire Bob Melvin. He was the Padres manager, now moving to the Giants. So the Padres will need to find a manager. Pat Murphy being hired by the Brewers. He was their bench coach. Now, you may ask, why is there a Brewers opening? Well, the Cubs hired away Craig Counsell. That's a huge deal. Counsell, one of the best managers in all of baseball. And he will replace David Ross there. It's a big gain for the Chicago Cubs. The Mets have hired the Yankees bench coach Carlos Mendoza as their manager. The Guardians have hired Stephen Vogt, the Mariners bullpen coach, as their manager, and the Astros hiring their bench coach Joe Espada as their manager. So the only team without a manager at the moment is the Padres, who will continue to search. Let's talk about the National Women's Soccer League final between OL Reign and Gotham FC, representing New York and New Jersey. And it was Gotham FC that came out on top in Ali Krieger's final career game. She finally gets her NWSL championship. Now, Megan Rapinoe, she was aiming for the same thing on the Sounders side. She left the game injured in what she fears is an Achilles tear in the 4th minute. Just an absolutely devastating blow for a legendary career for Megan Rapinoe, known more so for her work on the U.S. women's national team, but also a great player for OL Reign. Now, this game did get chippy at the end. The goalie for Gotham FC got a red card in stoppage time, but ultimately they did come out on top 2-1. OL Reign's sole goal was by Rose Lavelle in the 29th minute. Gotham FC had a goal by Lynn Williams in the 24th minute, and then the goal that put them ahead for good in stoppage time in the first half by Esther Gonzalez. So, big win there to get a title for Gotham FC. Now, in other women's soccer news, the U.S. women's national team, they've hired Emma Hayes as their head coach. This is a big gain for the U.S. women's national team. She's the head coach of Chelsea. Just a very, very good hire for the U.S. women's national team, replacing Vlatko Andonovski, who he came under fire a lot during the World Cup for his tactical decisions. Just did not seem like he really knew what he was doing. But that is going to do it for this episode of C&C Talks, and Charlie will be back soon, so make sure that you subscribe. We apologize for him having to leave this episode early. Make sure you subscribe. Episodes available every single week wherever you listen to podcasts. Our website, cctalks.com, is everything you need to know about the show, and you can call us with questions at 360-389-2630. Again, that's 360-389-2630, and you can follow us on Twitter at CC Talks Podcast, and follow Charlie at CC Talks Charlie. For producer Morris, our production designer Zach, and our sound designer Drake, and of course for Charlie, I'm Colin. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.